On May 15th, 1911, the United States Supreme Court declared Standard Oil an illegal monopoly and ordered its dissolution. The richest man in the world, John D. Rockefeller, had just lost. His empire, built over 40 years, would be shattered into 34 separate companies. The newspapers celebrated, the public cheered. The government had finally broken the untouchable monopoly. But John D. Rockefeller wasn't worried. He understood something the Supreme Court, the journalists, and the public didn't. The breakup wasn't the end of his system. It was the system's greatest triumph. Because 3 months after the court's decision, Rockefeller's wealth didn't decrease. It tripled. Standard Oil stock, worth $600 per share before the breakup, exploded to over $2,000 across the combined value of the 34 companies. Rockefeller, who owned shares in every single piece, became 3 times richer the day his monopoly was destroyed than he'd been the day before. This wasn't luck. This was engineering. And once you understand how this was engineered, you'll recognize the same structure everywhere. Rockefeller had built something far more powerful than a company. He'd built a machine that generated wealth automatically, that survived legal attacks, that grew stronger when broken apart, and that would transfer wealth from the bottom to the top for generations after his death. Right now, in 2026, 115 years after that Supreme Court decision, the machine is running faster than ever. ExxonMobil generated $293 billion in revenue last year. Chevron, $200 billion. BP, $214 billion. These 3 companies, all direct descendants of Standard Oil, control more of the global oil market today than Standard Oil controlled in 1911. But oil is just the beginning. The machine Rockefeller built, the wealth extraction system he engineered, it didn't stop with petroleum. It spread to every industry that matters. Technology, pharmaceuticals, finance, agriculture, media. Every sector of the modern economy operates on the blueprint Rockefeller perfected between 1863 and 1911. The blueprint that breaks competition, captures regulators, and compounds wealth across generations. Let me show you exactly how Rockefeller engineered this machine, the 3 mechanisms that make it self-perpetuating, why the 1911 breakup was the system's most brilliant move, and why every dollar you spend today feeds wealth into the same extraction system Rockefeller designed 150 years ago. Because this isn't just history. This is the architecture of modern wealth, and once you understand how it works, you'll see it operating everywhere, every single day, extracting value from your labor and concentrating it in the hands of people whose great-great-grandfather knew Rockefeller personally. John D. Rockefeller was born in 1839 in upstate New York. His father was a traveling salesman and con artist who abandoned the family for months at a time. His mother was a strict Baptist who raised 6 children in poverty while her husband was gone. This childhood created the 2 traits that would define Rockefeller's business philosophy. First, absolute distrust of anyone he couldn't control. Second, complete moral certainty that whatever he did was righteous because he was bringing order to chaos. These weren't contradictions. They were the foundation. In 1855, at age 16, Rockefeller became a bookkeeper in Cleveland. He kept precise financial records, tracked every penny, and learned that numbers revealed truth that people hid. He learned that the person who controlled the books controlled the business. And he learned that most businessmen didn't understand their own numbers. They operated on instinct, on hope, on luck. Rockefeller operated on calculation. In 1859, oil was discovered in Pennsylvania. The oil rush began. Thousands of men flooded into Titusville to drill. It was chaos. Wells would strike oil, and overnight a man became rich. Then the well would run dry, and he was broke. Oil prices swung wildly. 50 cents a barrel one month, $10 the next. Fortunes were made and lost in weeks. Everyone saw opportunity in drilling. Rockefeller saw something different. He saw that drilling was gambling. You could hit oil or you could hit nothing. But refining, turning crude oil into kerosene for lamps, that was predictable. If you controlled refining, you controlled the entire oil business, because drillers needed refiners to make their crude valuable, and consumers needed refined kerosene to light their homes. Refiners sat in the middle. They controlled the bottleneck. In 1863, Rockefeller invested $4,000 in a Cleveland refinery. It was a small operation, one of 30 refineries in the city, but Rockefeller didn't plan to stay small. Within 2 years, his refinery was the largest in Cleveland, not because he drilled better oil, because he refined it more efficiently. He bought timber to build his own barrels instead of buying expensive barrels from suppliers. He built his own warehouses instead of renting storage. He hired chemists to extract every usable product from crude oil. While other refiners got kerosene and threw away the rest, Rockefeller's refineries extracted kerosene, paraffin wax, petroleum jelly, lubricating oil, and dozens of other products from the same barrel of crude. His costs were 40% lower than competitors. This gave him the power to do something unprecedented. He could lower prices and still make profit. And when he lowered prices, competitors had two choices: match the price and lose money, or hold the price and lose customers. Most chose to lose customers. Then they went bankrupt. Then Rockefeller bought their refineries. This was the first mechanism: cost dominance through operational control. It seems simple. It's not. Because cost dominance creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Lower costs mean higher profits. Higher profits mean more capital to invest in even better efficiency. Better efficiency means even lower costs. The cycle accelerates. Your advantage grows. Your competitors fall further behind. Eventually, they can't compete at all. They either sell to you or they die. That's mechanism one. The next two are why it never stopped. Rockefeller understood this cycle. He engineered it deliberately. By 1870, he controlled 25% of Cleveland's refining capacity. But Cleveland was just one city. America had refineries in New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and dozens of smaller cities. Rockefeller wanted them all, and he had a plan to get them. In 1872, Rockefeller approached the major railroads: the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Erie Railroad, the New York Central. He made them an offer. Standard Oil would guarantee regular shipments of oil, enormous volume, predictable revenue. In exchange, the railroads would give Rockefeller secret rebates, not just discounts on his own shipments. Rebates on his competitors' shipments, too. Here's how it worked. If a competitor paid the railroad $1 per barrel to ship oil, the railroad would secretly pay Rockefeller 25 cents of that dollar as a kickback. Rockefeller's competitors were literally paying him to ship their own oil. And this is where the system stops being competitive and starts being inevitable. The railroads agreed. They needed the volume. Rockefeller controlled enough oil to make or break their revenue. Once he had the railroad rebates, Rockefeller's cost advantage became insurmountable. He could ship oil for 75 cents per barrel. His competitors paid $1.25. That 50-cent difference on every barrel meant Rockefeller could sell kerosene at prices that bankrupted anyone who tried to compete. But the railroad rebates did something even more important. They gave Rockefeller information. The railroads told him exactly how much oil his competitors were shipping, where they were shipping it, who they were selling to. Rockefeller knew his competitors' business better than they did. He knew when they were struggling. He knew when they were succeeding. And he used that information to time his attacks. If a refinery was doing well, Rockefeller would drop prices in that market until the refinery started losing money. Then he'd send a representative with an offer to buy. The refinery owner, watching his profits evaporate, would usually sell. If he didn't, Rockefeller would keep the price war going until bankruptcy forced the sale. This was the second mechanism: information asymmetry through institutional capture. Rockefeller didn't just compete with other refineries. He controlled the infrastructure they depended on. The railroads weren't neutral. They were Rockefeller's partners. And that partnership gave him visibility into his competitors' operations and the power to strangle them, economically, whenever he chose. Between 1872 and 1879, Rockefeller bought or destroyed every major refinery in America. In Cleveland, he acquired 25 of the city's 26 refineries in 3 months. The newspapers called it the Cleveland Massacre. In Pittsburgh, he bought out the refiners who supplied the entire western Pennsylvania oil region. In New York, he bought the largest refining operation on the East Coast. In Philadelphia, Baltimore, and everywhere else that mattered, Rockefeller bought the dominant refineries. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity. 90%. That's not market leadership, that's total domination. But controlling 90% of refining created a problem. Monopolies were unpopular. The public hated them. And more importantly, they were illegal under state laws. Standard Oil of Ohio, Rockefeller's original company, couldn't legally own refineries in other states. So Rockefeller's lawyers invented a solution. In 1882, they created the Standard Oil Trust. Here's how it worked. All Standard Oil companies transferred their stock to a board of trustees. The board had 9 members, all Rockefeller and his closest associates. The board controlled all the companies. This structure allowed Rockefeller to control refineries in every state, while technically complying with state corporate laws. But more importantly, the trust structure created something new: legal distance between ownership and operation. The trust didn't produce anything. It didn't refine oil. It just owned companies that did. This meant if Standard Oil of New York got sued, the trust wasn't liable. If Standard Oil of California faced regulatory action, the trust was protected. The trust structure insulated wealth from risk. It separated control from consequence. This was the third mechanism: structural insulation through legal architecture. Rockefeller didn't just build a company, he built a legal entity, designed to survive attacks, to shield wealth, and to transfer control across generations without losing coherence. The trust was the prototype for every modern corporate structure. Holding companies, parent corporations, subsidiary networks, they all descend from Rockefeller's 1882 innovation, and they all serve the same purpose: concentrate control diffuse liability, compound wealth. By 1904, Standard Oil controlled 91% of oil refining and 85% of final oil sales. Rockefeller personally owned about 30% of the company. His net worth was $900 million. In 1904, money, that's roughly $25 billion in today's dollars. But that massively understates his true wealth, because Rockefeller's wealth wasn't just money. It was control over the flow of energy across an industrializing nation. Every factory needed oil. Every railroad needed oil. Every lamp in every home needed kerosene. And 91% of it flowed through Rockefeller's system. He didn't just have money, he had leverage over the entire economy. But the public was turning. Investigative journalists, called muckrakers, were exposing Standard Oil's tactics. Ida Tarbell, whose father had been bankrupted by Rockefeller, spent years investigating the company. In 1904, she published The History of the Standard Oil Company, a devastating expose of the railroad rebates, the predatory pricing, the systematic destruction of competitors. The outcry was enormous. Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, making monopolies illegal. But the law had barely been enforced. Now there was political pressure to use it. In 1906, the federal government filed suit against Standard Oil. The case took 5 years to work through the courts. During that time, Rockefeller quietly restructured his holdings. He transferred assets. He established trusts for his children. He moved wealth into foundations. He prepared for the inevitable. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court ruled Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly. It must be broken into 34 separate companies. Each company would be independent. None would be allowed to coordinate with the others. Competition would be restored. This should have been a disaster for Rockefeller. The empire he'd spent 40 years building was being dismantled by federal order. But Rockefeller understood something the government didn't. The breakup wasn't destroying the system, it was perfecting it. Because when Standard Oil was broken into 34 companies, Rockefeller still owned shares in all of them. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Ohio became Sohio, later bought by BP. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. All 34 companies were now technically separate, but they were all descended from the same parent. They all operated in the same markets. They all used the same refining techniques. They all drew from the same talent pool of managers who'd worked for Standard Oil. They all understood that cooperation, even informal cooperation, was more profitable than real competition. The breakup forced these companies to appear independent, but economic incentives pushed them toward coordination. And as long as they didn't explicitly collude, they could coordinate through price signaling, market division, and informal agreements without violating antitrust law. This was the brilliance of the breakup. It turned one illegal monopoly into 34 legal oligopolies. Before the breakup, Standard Oil stock traded at roughly $600 per share. After the breakup, the combined value of all 34 successor companies was worth over $2,000. Rockefeller's shares tripled in value. He went from $900 million to over $2 billion. The day his monopoly was broken, he became the richest man in history. Why did the stock surge? Because the breakup removed regulatory risk. Before 1911, Standard Oil faced constant legal battles, political attacks, public hatred. After 1911, those battles disappeared. The 34 companies were legal. They competed just enough to avoid antitrust scrutiny. And they all remained dominant in their respective markets. Investors recognized this immediately. The breakup hadn't destroyed Standard Oil's market power. It had legitimized it. The system survived. It evolved. And it got stronger. This is why breaking up companies rarely break systems. If you're still here, you're exactly who this is for. Hit-like, because most people never even learned the blueprint exists. Rockefeller lived another 26 years after the breakup. He died in 1937 at age 97. But the wealth machine he'd built didn't die with him. It compounded. Let me show you how the three mechanisms, cost dominance, information asymmetry, and structural insulation, have operated for the 14 years since the breakup, and why they're more powerful now than they were in Rockefeller's lifetime. First, cost dominance. The 34 companies created in 1911 immediately began reconsolidating. Not through merger, that would be illegal. Through informal coordination and eventual remergers, once enough time had passed and regulators looked the other way. In 1999, Exxon and Mobil merged. Two of the largest pieces of Standard Oil recombined into ExxonMobil. The merger created the largest oil company in the world. Revenues of $293 billion in 2023, profits of $36 billion. ExxonMobil has the lowest production costs in the industry, just like Rockefeller. They control refineries, shipping, retail gas stations, and chemical plants. Vertical integration, just like Rockefeller. They can afford to lower prices when competitors threaten, because their costs are lower, just like Rockefeller. The cost dominance mechanism is still running. Chevron, another Standard Oil descendant, has revenues of $200 billion. BP, which absorbed Amoco and Sohio, two more Standard Oil pieces, has revenues of $214 billion. Three companies, all descended from Standard Oil, control roughly 15% of the global oil market. That's down from 91% in 1911. But the global oil market is 50 times larger. They control a smaller share of a vastly bigger pie. And oil isn't just fuel anymore, it's plastics, pharmaceuticals, synthetic materials, fertilizers. The descendants of Standard Oil control the chemical foundations of modern civilization. Second, information asymmetry. In Rockefeller's time, he captured railroads to gain information about competitors. Today, the mechanism operates through data and lobbying. The oil industry spends $120 million annually lobbying the federal government. They don't just influence policy, they write it. Energy regulations are drafted by industry. Consultants, approved by Congress and enforced by regulators who came from the industry and will return to it after their government service ends. This is called regulatory capture, and it's exactly what Rockefeller did with railroads, just scaled up. The industry also controls information, climate research funding, scientific journals, university departments. They know what research is being done before it's published. They know what regulations are being proposed before they're announced. They know what their competitors are doing through trade associations and informal networks. Information asymmetry, just like Rockefeller. Third, structural insulation. This is where the system has evolved most. Rockefeller's trust structure became the modern holding company. ExxonMobil is a holding company that owns dozens of subsidiaries. Chevron, same structure. BP, same structure. These structures shield wealth from liability. When BP's Deepwater Horizon rig exploded in 2010, killing 11 workers and spilling millions of barrels of oil, BP paid $65 billion in fines and settlements. That sounds enormous, but BP's total assets are nearly $300 billion. The fine was 20% of assets. Painful, but not fatal. And the holding company structure meant the parent company never faced existential risk. The subsidiary that owned the rig could be sacrificed. The parent survived. This is what Rockefeller designed. Legal architecture that absorbs catastrophic failures without collapsing. But structural insulation goes further. It compounds wealth across generations. Rockefeller's personal fortune, estimated at $400 billion in inflation-adjusted dollars at his peak, was transferred to his children through trusts and foundations. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., controlled that wealth. Jr.'s children, the third generation, inherited through more trusts. The fourth generation, the fifth generation, they're still living off Rockefeller's wealth. Not because they're smart, because the legal structures compound wealth automatically. The Rockefeller family today is estimated to have $11 billion spread across hundreds of family members. That's massively diluted from the original fortune, but it's still $11 billion more than most American families will ever see. And that's just direct descendants. The real wealth is institutional. The Rockefeller Foundation, created in 1913, has $35 billion in assets. It funds global health initiatives, education, scientific research. It shapes policy worldwide. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, another foundation, has over $1 billion in assets. The University of Chicago, funded by Rockefeller, has an endowment of $11 billion. Rockefeller University, which he founded, has $3 billion. Add it all up. The Rockefeller family's direct wealth, the foundations, the institutions, the universities. The total wealth controlled by entities Rockefeller created or funded exceeds $60 billion. 114 years after the Standard Oil breakup, Rockefeller's wealth is still compounding. This is the system. Cost dominance maintains market control. Information asymmetry prevents competition. Structural insulation compounds wealth across generations. And the system replicates. Because Rockefeller didn't just build it for oil, he built it as a blueprint. Let me show you how the exact same three mechanisms operate in industries that didn't exist when Rockefeller died. Technology. Amazon Web Services controls 32% of the cloud computing market. Microsoft Azure has 23%. Google Cloud has 10%. Three companies control 65% of the infrastructure that runs the internet. How did they achieve this? Cost dominance. Amazon built massive data centers with economies of scale no competitor can match. They can offer cloud services at prices smaller companies can't compete with, just like Rockefeller's refineries. Information asymmetry. Amazon Web Services hosts websites for thousands of companies. Amazon Retail competes with many of those companies. Amazon sees their traffic, their sales data, their customer behavior. Then Amazon uses that information to compete against them. Just like Rockefeller's railroad rebates. Structural insulation. Amazon is a holding company. If AWS faces a lawsuit, it doesn't threaten Amazon Retail. If Amazon Retail faces regulatory action, AWS is insulated. The structure diffuses risk, just like Rockefeller's trust. Pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical industry uses the Rockefeller playbook explicitly because Rockefeller built it. In 1901, Rockefeller founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, later Rockefeller University. The institute shaped modern medicine. It funded research. It trained doctors. It established standards. And those standards favored pharmaceutical interventions. Why? Because Rockefeller's chemical divisions, spin-offs from Standard, oils refining operations, produced pharmaceuticals, shaping medical education to favor pharmaceutical treatments, created guaranteed demand for products made by Rockefeller-affiliated companies. Today, Pfizer has revenues of $60 billion, Johnson & Johnson, $94 billion, Merck, $60 billion. These companies use cost dominance through patent protection. They use information asymmetry through FDA capture, and they use structural insulation through holding companies and offshore subsidiaries. The mechanisms are identical to Standard Oil. Finance: J.P. Morgan Chase is a holding company with assets of $3.8 trillion. Bank of America, $3.1 trillion. Citigroup, $2.4 trillion. Three banks control $9 trillion in assets. That's 40% of U.S. GDP. How? Cost dominance through scale. They can offer services at costs community banks can't match. Information asymmetry through regulatory capture. Bank executives rotate between Wall Street and the Treasury Department. They write financial regulations. Structural insulation through holding company structures that make them too big to fail. When they collapse, the government bails them out. Because allowing them to fail would destroy the economy, this gives them implicit insurance. They can take massive risks knowing they'll be rescued. The mechanisms are identical to Standard Oil. Agriculture. 4 companies control 85% of U.S. beef processing. Tyson, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef. 4 companies control 73% of soybean processing. The consolidation in agriculture mirrors Standard Oil exactly, and it happened through the same mechanisms: cost dominance through scale, information asymmetry through market intelligence and supply chain control, structural insulation through holding companies and political lobbying. Every major industry in America operates on the blueprint Rockefeller perfected. Cost dominance eliminates competition. Information asymmetry prevents new competitors from emerging. Structural insulation compounds wealth across generations. The system is self-perpetuating, and it's legal. Here's why you can't escape it. The system isn't designed to be obvious. It's designed to appear as natural market outcomes. Competition seems to exist. You can choose between Exxon, Chevron, and Shell, between Amazon, Walmart, and Target, between J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, and Citigroup. But you're choosing between branches of the same tree, all using the same 3 mechanisms, all concentrating wealth at the top, all extracting value from the bottom. The average American household spends $60,000 annually. Where does that money go? $5,000 on transportation, much of it gasoline from Standard Oil descendants, $6,000 on food, processed by 4 agricultural conglomerates, $12,000 on housing, financed by one of 3 major banks, $4,000 on healthcare, paying for pharmaceuticals, made by companies using Rockefeller's medical system, $6,000 on utilities and energy, provided by companies descended from or modeled on Standard Oil. That's $33,000 out of $60,000 flowing to industries operating on the Rockefeller blueprint. Over 50% of your income. Over a lifetime, that's $1.6 million. Not going to small businesses, not going to competitive markets, going to consolidated industries using 100-year-old mechanisms to eliminate competition and extract maximum value. And this system compounds. The wealth extracted from your labor gets invested. Those investments generate returns. The returns get reinvested. Over generations, wealth compounds exponentially. The Rockefeller fortune started with $4,000 in 1863. It grew to $400 billion by 1913. That's a 100,000x return in 50 years. Most of that wealth is still compounding in foundations, universities, and descendant companies. You cannot opt out. You need energy. The energy sector is consolidated. You need food. Agriculture is consolidated. You need financial services. Banking is consolidated. You need internet services. Technology is consolidated. Every necessity flows through systems built on the Rockefeller model. Competition exists at the margins. But the core infrastructure, the bottlenecks that control entire industries, those are dominated by a handful of companies using the 3 mechanisms. This is what Rockefeller understood. Control the bottleneck. Control the flow. Extract value from every transaction. And build legal structures that compound the value across generations. The 1911 breakup didn't destroy the system. It validated it. It proved the system could survive government intervention. It proved that breaking one monopoly into 34 legal oligopolies was more profitable than maintaining one illegal monopoly. It proved that structural insulation works. Rockefeller's wealth tripled the day his monopoly was broken. That wasn't an accident. That was the system demonstrating its core feature. Adaptation through apparent defeat. The system is designed to absorb a tax. When regulators break up companies, the pieces recombine eventually. When politicians demand reform, the industry writes the reforms. When the public demands competition, the oligopolies compete just enough to appear legitimate while coordinating just enough to maintain dominance. This is the machine Rockefeller built, not a company, a system. And systems don't die when their creator dies. They evolve. John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, 88 years ago. But walk into any gas station today. The brands above the pumps are Exxon, Mobil, Chevron. Standard Oil's children. Look at your bank statement. J.P. Morgan Chase, named for Rockefeller's partner. Check your prescriptions. Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Merck. Companies that grew from Rockefeller's medical system. Look at the Fortune 500. Nearly every industry is dominated by 3 to 5 companies using the same 3 mechanisms. Cost dominance, information asymmetry, structural insulation. The Rockefeller system is the modern economy. And here's what should terrify you. It's accelerating. In 1950, the Fortune 500 companies controlled roughly 40% of U.S. GDP. Today, they control 75%. In 1980, the 3 largest banks controlled 10% of U.S. banking assets. Today, 35%. In 1990, the 4 largest agricultural processors controlled 55% of beef processing. Today, 85%. Every decade, the consolidation increases, the mechanisms get stronger, the wealth compounds faster, and the distance between the extractors and the extracted grows wider. In 1970, the average CEO made 20 times what the average worker made. Today, 300 times. That's not because CEOs got 15 times more talented. It's because the mechanisms that concentrate wealth have gotten 15 times more efficient. Rockefeller's genius wasn't building Standard Oil. His genius was building mechanisms that would continue concentrating wealth long after he was dead. Mechanisms that would spread to every industry. Mechanisms that would become embedded in corporate law, tax code, and regulatory frameworks. Mechanisms that would turn his $4,000 initial investment into a system that extracts trillions annually and compounds that wealth across generations. You cannot escape this system. You can only understand it. Understanding means recognizing that the competition you think exists is largely theatrical, that the choices you think you have are between branches of the same oligopolies, that the regulations meant to protect you were written by the industries being regulated, that the wealth you create through your labor is being extracted through systems designed 150 years ago. Understanding means recognizing that when people talk about free markets and capitalism, they're describing a mythology. What actually exists is consolidated oligopoly operating on the Rockefeller blueprint. Understanding means recognizing that breaking up these companies won't fix the system. Because the system survived its own breakup in 1911. The breakup made it stronger. The only way to break the system is to break the mechanisms. Prevent cost dominance by breaking up companies before they achieve monopolistic scale. Prevent information asymmetry by banning industry lobbying and regulatory capture. Prevent structural insulation by eliminating holding company structures and making executives personally liable. But here's the problem. Those fixes require political will, and political will requires public understanding. And the public doesn't understand because the system is designed to be invisible. Most people don't know that Exxon and Mobil were both Standard Oil. They don't know that the pharmaceutical industry was shaped by Rockefeller's foundations. They don't know that the holding company structure was Rockefeller's invention. They don't know they're living inside a system engineered in 1882. The system survives through invisibility, and invisibility is maintained through complexity. Corporate structures too complicated to understand, supply chains too sprawling to track, ownership networks too tangled to map. The system hides in plain sight, and it extracts wealth while you're not looking. John D. Rockefeller built a machine that turns your labor into wealth for people you'll never meet. People whose great-great-grandfathers knew Rockefeller personally. People who inherit wealth compounded across 5 generations. People who control foundations, universities, and corporations that shape your life without your knowledge or consent. This isn't conspiracy. This is structure. Legal, documented, replicated across every major industry. Rockefeller didn't hide what he built. He wrote about it. He defended it. He believed it was righteous. And in a sense, he was right. The system works. It delivers products efficiently. It drives innovation through scale. It creates economic growth. The problem isn't that it doesn't work. The problem is who it works for. It works for the people who own the mechanisms, the people who control the bottlenecks, the people whose wealth compounds while yours stagnates. Rockefeller understood this completely. He said, competition is a sin. Most people hear that as greed, but Rockefeller meant it literally. Competition is wasteful. It duplicates effort. It destroys capital. Monopoly is efficient. It concentrates resources. It eliminates waste. And most importantly, it concentrates wealth in the hands of people capable of managing it, people like Rockefeller. This was his genuine belief. He wasn't stealing, he was organizing. He wasn't extracting, he was optimizing. He wasn't monopolizing. He was bringing order to chaos. And from his perspective, the wealth he accumulated was proof that the system worked, because wealth flows to efficiency. And he was the most efficient. This worldview became the foundation of American capitalism. Not free market competition, oligopolistic consolidation, not many small competitors, 3 to 5 dominant players. Not government regulation, industry self-regulation through captured regulators. The system Rockefeller built became the template, and everyone who came after him learned the template. Andrew Carnegie in steel, J.P. Morgan in banking, Bill Gates in software, Jeff Bezos in retail, Mark Zuckerberg in social media. They all use the same 3 mechanisms: cost dominance through scale, information asymmetry through market control, structural insulation through legal architecture. They all built systems designed to compound wealth across generations. They all created foundations to avoid taxes and shape policy. They all captured regulators to eliminate competition. They all learned from Rockefeller, because Rockefeller proved the model works. His $4,000 investment became a $400 billion fortune. His company survived its own government-ordered breakup and came back stronger. His wealth is still compounding 114 years after the breakup and 88 years after his death. The model works, and it's been replicated so many times that it's no longer a model. It's the structure of the economy, which brings us to the question nobody wants to answer. If you can't escape the system, what do you do? Option 1. Accept it. Understand that consolidation is inevitable, that oligopoly is efficient, that wealth will compound at the top while stagnating at the bottom. Use the system's efficiencies. Buy from Amazon. Bank with J.P. Morgan. Invest in the oligopolies and capture some of the wealth they extract. This is pragmatic. It's also surrender. Option 2. Resist it. Support antitrust enforcement. Buy from small businesses. Vote for politicians who promise to break up. Monopolies. Organize labor to capture more of the value you create. This is noble. It's also exhausting, because the system is designed to absorb resistance. Option 3. Understand it without accepting or resisting. See the mechanisms operating. Recognize when cost dominance is eliminating competition. Recognize when information asymmetry is preventing new entrants. Recognize when structural insulation is compounding wealth. Understand that you're inside a machine built 150 years ago, a machine that survived its own destruction, a machine that extracts wealth from your labor and concentrates it in the hands of people whose great-great-grandfathers designed the system. Understanding doesn't change the system, but it changes how you see it. And seeing it clearly is the first step toward building something different, because the Rockefeller system isn't eternal. It's just very, very good at surviving. It survived the 1911 breakup. It survived the Great Depression. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the New Deal regulations. It survived the 1970s antitrust movement. It survived every challenge for 114 years. But survival isn't the same as inevitability. Systems that survive for centuries eventually fail. Rome fell. The British Empire fell. The Soviet Union fell. Every system that seems permanent eventually breaks. The Rockefeller system will break too. The question is when, and what replaces it, and whether you'll understand what happened when it does. Because the system's greatest weapon isn't cost dominance or information asymmetry or structural insulation. Its greatest weapon is invisibility. Most people don't know they're inside it. They think they're making free choices in competitive markets. They think wealth accumulates through talent and hard work. They think the economy's fair. They're wrong, but they don't know they're wrong. And as long as they don't know, the system continues. Extracting, concentrating, compounding, generation after generation after generation. If this changed how you see the economy, subscribe, because this wasn't the whole system. It was one blueprint. John D. Rockefeller died 88 years ago, but his machine is still running, still extracting wealth from you, still concentrating it at the top, still compounding it across generations. The machine is the modern economy, and you live inside it, whether you know it or not.